forward to what will be an insightful and interesting discussion. I want to give as much time as possible to the rest of our speakers, so I'll kind of keep this introduction brief. Each of the participants today are active members of civil society organizations with direct lived experiences of the issues that we will be discussing. So I'm looking forward to hearing more about each of their work. As Simon mentioned, I'm Rights and Security International's UK Accountability Officer, in which I aim to hold the UK government to account when it takes measures in the name of national security that could violate human rights. My particular interest in this topic comes from some ongoing research I'm conducting in Indonesia, in which I'm looking into the UK government's support for potentially rights violating, preventing and countering violent extremism programs. I've heard firsthand about how these measures are disproportionately impacting Indigenous communities in the country. We're due to publish a research report at the beginning of next year, which I urge you to keep an eye out for. As I was preparing for this webinar, I was struck by one key point, which I felt important to emphasize in my opening remarks. While the experiences and issues each of our speakers have experienced vary, and they also span different time zones and continents, there are similarities between their experiences. To me, this demonstrates the potential of collaborative and international advocacy on these important issues, while also learning from our counterparts across the globe by utilizing creative and impactful advocacy strategies. In just under 2 weeks' time, on the 9th of August, the UN will be commemorating the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which has been held since UN General Assembly Resolution 49-214 was passed in December 1994. However, the UN has been working on Indigenous rights issues for even longer, including with the establishment of the Working Group on Indigenous Populations in 1982. At the same time as these commemorations, Indigenous groups are either being expressly targeted by repressive government measures worldwide, or are facing the disproportionate effects of other government policies. Additionally, we have seen Indigenous populations being disproportionately impacted by both the COVID-19 pandemic and by government responses to that pandemic. In the past few months, for instance, we have seen Tanzanian security forces encroaching on Maasai land and housing, while using live ammunition and tear gas against local communities, while the Brazilian Senate will soon be considering a draft bill, often referred to as the poison package bill, which will weaken regulations governing the use of pesticides in that country. While, of course, the ongoing climate crisis continues to impact Indigenous groups. It is with that I'll now hand over to our first speaker. I'm delighted to introduce Sarah Bestain Beckham. Sarah belongs to the Indigenous peoples of the Cordillera region in northern Philippines. She's currently the Secretary General of the Cordillera Peoples Alliance. She is also the Asia Program Director of Land is Life, a global network for Indigenous peoples' rights, human rights, and environmental protection. During the pandemic, Bestain, along with Indigenous human rights defenders, experienced intensified terrorist labeling and state persecution. In 2021, she was faced with a cyber libel case filed by the Cordillera police chief when she spoke about the police's desecration of the monument of Indigenous peoples' heroes. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jacob, and good evening from the Philippines. I do have a slideshow, if it can be put up on screen.
Eu tenho uma apresentação que vai estar disponível na tela.
I am hearing the translation. So anyway, this is a photo of Indigenous peoples in the Philippines. Indigenous peoples comprise 15% of the country's population, or around 15 million, and many of us live in mountainous areas where one can find most of the remaining biodiversity and underground minerals, especially gold and copper. In fact, the Philippines is located within the Pacific Ring of Fire, where plate tectonic movements occur, which is why we have a lot of mineral deposits, and which is also why sometimes we experience strong earthquakes. And just this morning, actually, our region was hit by a magnitude 7.3 earthquake, which for us is already very strong. Damages and casualties continue being accounted. So just please lend us your prayers. So in the next slide, in the Philippines, the laws and policies favor corporations and allow the intrusion of large-scale corporate projects which threaten and undermine our rights as indigenous peoples. Oftentimes, we are excluded from land use decisions. Our right to free, prior, and informed consent is manipulated, rendering us susceptible to expropriation and displacement. In the next slide, you will see a map of our region, the Cordillera in northern Philippines. Currently, there are 96 hydropower projects that have already been awarded by the Department of Energy to private companies. And there are more than 100 large-scale mining applications. So the yellow shaded parts in the map are the areas covered by mining applications. In the map are the energy projects. And the small green signs show the spread of the military. And it is notable that where there are active opposition against mining and dam projects, that's also where the military are deployed, resulting in various forms of human rights violations. In the next slide, you will see a table of the human rights violations committed against indigenous peoples during the time of President Duterte, because our commitment to protect our ancestral lands has always been met with state persecution. So over the past years, some of you may have known this, that the Philippines has consistently topped the most dangerous countries in Asia and the world based on the number of environment and land defenders killed. That's according to Global Witness. And many of the victims were indigenous peoples. And behind these extrajudicial killings and the widespread human rights violations that are being committed against indigenous peoples are the state security program and counterinsurgency policies. Next slide. During the term of former President Rodrigo Duterte, he implemented a counterinsurgency program which we called IP-centric or indigenous people-centric, putting indigenous peoples at the heart of this counterinsurgency program, where members and leaders of indigenous communities and our organizations are being killed, harassed, falsely charged, illegally arrested, and detained. Duterte also issued an executive order which mandated all government agencies and departments to implement and align their activities with the National Security Plan. And then he appointed 73 military and police officials to at least 46 civilian agencies or government agencies. So the heads of government agencies are mostly military generals. And of recent, he issued Executive Number 70, which established the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict. And this is the one that has worsened the attacks against indigenous peoples with impunity. In 2017, President Duterte declared the Communist Party of the Philippines, New People's Army as terrorist organizations, which is why it is dangerous to be labeled as a communist in the Philippines. But this labeling of individuals and groups as members of the Communist Party, New People's Army, is a frequently used weapon used by the state elements to stifle criticisms and justify their attacks against us. At the height of the pandemic, despite strong opposition, the Duterte government passed the Anti-Terrorism Law, which is a draconian law having a very vague definition of terrorism, where anybody can be easily designated as a terrorist by mere suspicion. So this law and anti-insurgency policies of the government are particularly dangerous for us indigenous peoples, because any form of defense of our ancestral lands and resources may result in arrest, detention, shoot-to-kill orders, extrajudicial killings, and other forms of human rights violations. The problem there is no distinction that is being made between armed combatants and civilians. So we are targeted in these counterinsurgency policies and the anti-terror law of the government. In the next slide, during the pandemic also, many of us have been subjected to widespread red tagging and disinformation, especially by the military and police, and they even included our families. Now, red tagging and terrorist labeling is dangerous because in our experience, these are precursors of extrajudicial killings and trump-up charges. Some of our leaders have already been charged with trump-up cases of murder and illegal possession of firearms and explosives. And then there's the cyber libel case that was filed by the former chief of police against me. When I spoke about the police hand in the desecration of the monument of our heroes, the government has also embarked on a campaign to declare our organization, the Cordillera People's Alliance, as persona non grata or unwanted in the communities without basis. So these are examples of how we are being criminalized and how the laws are being used as a weapon to attack indigenous peoples, plus the continued use of the pandemic situation by the government for political repression. Now, obviously, the anti-insurgency and terror policies of the government are being used to silence indigenous peoples in order that the so-called development programs and the government's neoliberal economic agenda that we oppose are implemented in our territories. So these policies are actually being used to sow terror in our community so that now fear is felt by many because the threats to our lives and safety are real. So this is why indigenous peoples in the Philippines are calling for the scrapping of the anti-terror law, Executive Order 70, and other anti-insurgency policies of the government. Nevertheless, despite all of the attacks, we continue to defend our lands and our rights as indigenous peoples. And for those who may have followed updates in the Philippines, now we have a new president as a result of the recent elections. However, we do not expect that the situation will change to the better because the new president, who is the son of a dictator, in his speech, State of the Nation address last Monday, he wants to continue the plunder of indigenous lands through mining and dams. And worse, he spoke nothing about the human rights and indigenous people's rights violations, which only means that these violations will continue, if not bound to worsen. So we need the support and solidarity of the international community, helping us lobby the United Nations and intergovernmental bodies, for instance, is already helpful in putting pressure on the Philippine government to stop the attacks against indigenous peoples. So that would be my short sharing of our situation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bestain. That was incredibly interesting and very insightful. Our second speaker for today is Daniel Kobe. Daniel is the Executive Director and founder of the Ogiek People's Development Program, an NGO promoting the human and land rights of the indigenous peoples of Kenya and Africa. One of his key achievements is leading the Ogiek to winning a landmark case against the government of Kenya at the African Court of Human and People's Rights, a judgment that was also hailed by the current UN Special Rapporteur on the rights of indigenous peoples. He has an MBA in Strategic Management from Egerton University, Kenya, and a postgraduate diploma in Project Appraisal and Management from Maastricht School of Management in the Netherlands. Daniel, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Simon, Jacob, and my fellow presenters. It is really an opportunity to share the struggle of the Ogiek community in Kenya. And Ogiek community is a minority indigenous community in Kenya, and we are mostly in Mau Forest Complex in Kenya. And we have a very long struggle, which makes us to really say we have seen everything as far as struggling is concerned. because one of the greatest violations which Ogiek face is the continued eviction in their ancestral land of Mao Forest Complex. This continued eviction started a long time ago, and it began from the colonial period, post-colonial period to the day Kenya. And I was fortunate to have been in the new team over 20 years, fighting for the struggle of Ogiek community. And maybe I'll request Simon if I can share my presentation so that, yes.
And just waiting for Iris to give me the rights, sorry, to share your presentation. Iris, if you can please give me the rights.
Hi, Simon. I am just teaching the interpreter how to pass the rights. Okay, now is with me. That's perfect. If you give me 1 minute, please, because there is a technical problem here.
So can Simon share then? Or?
That's perfect. Yeah, we are going to do that now. Just a minute. Okay. And perfect. Okay, Simon. There you are. You have your host.
Okay, apologies for that. Now I'm going to show you presentation.
Thank you. I think I had to introduce, this was the photo you see was our last meeting in Arusha after the reparation hearing or judgment, or rather at the 65th ordinary session in Arusha, Tanzania. This is when the Ogiek community were receiving their positive reparation judgment, which 51 of us went to Arusha to witness this particular session. I just proceed on, please. So this is just a brief about the Ogiek community as hunter-gatherer indigenous community in Kenya, who are staying around Mao Forest Complex and around Mount Elgon in Kenya. The current population of Ogiek is estimated to be 52,000 as per 2019 census. And the Ogiek community that live in Mao are mostly, say, the Ogiek of Mao are staying within 6 counties. That is Nakuru, Narok, Nandi, Uasin Gishu, Kericho, and Baringo. So mostly my presentation will be discussing mostly about the situation of Mao Forest Complex and how it is with the community. Please proceed on. This is the map of Kenya. For those who don't know where Kenya is, unfortunately, Kenya is the eastern side of Africa, and they border Uganda, the western side, and south to, and Sudan on northwestern, and then Ethiopia northern side, Somalia, and then of course Indian Ocean, and the southern side is Tanzania. So some of the areas shaded green are the game reserves, the so-called private, what you call protected areas, and you could see where the Ogiek is considered a protected area. So their land is already looked at as a conservation area. Move on. Yeah, the Ogiek land struggle, this part, and I think I've mentioned this. Proceed on, please. So the independent Kenya government inherited these problems where they continued evicting the Ogiek community from their ancestral land. And many times when they are doing that, the community lost a lot of their land, they lost a lot of their property, some of them died during that time. And then, but despite all that, we continued agitating for our land rights. And this has made it very, let me use the hearing because of noise. Just give me a minute, please. So, so they continued evicting, and in this case, many of the Ogiek land rights defenders are always affected by the situation. And you hear me? Okay, excellent.
Daniel, is everything? We can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So in the early 1990s, the government of Kenya promised to annex part of their land in Mau Forest, and they settled Ogiek, and they say they were going to do it once and for all. However, despite the forest land being annexed, no Ogiek received any land. In other words, the other communities got a chance. And in this case, there was an influx of other communities joining where the Ogiek are. Move on, please. So by 1996, the Ogiek had witnessed massive destruction of Mau Forest Complex in favor of agricultural activities by the incoming communities. The Ogiek could not take more destruction for their ancestral land. So in 1996, the Ogiek petitioned the government through the parliament over the Mau Forest Complex issue, but the government in response claimed that the land had already been set, they had already settled Ogiek in the area of Eastern Mau, which in real sense, there was no settlement. So they were unsatisfied with this response of their community, so they decided to file a case in the Kenyan courts, which stayed for years, from 1997 to 2009. So in 2009, we went to the African Court, to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights in the Banjul, the Gambia. Let's move on, please. I'm sorry, I'm not used to being controlled. I need to move it myself. Just, yeah. So in October 2009, a 14-day notice of eviction was issued to all settlers in East Mau, and faced with the imminent eviction, the Ogiek felt that it was time. They sought intervention from the regional justice mechanism. That's when we went to the African Commission. So within same year, provisional measures was given, restricting further eviction of the Ogiek community. And all these, it was creating trouble. In March 2012, the African Commission decided to forward the Ogiek case to the African Court on Human and People's Rights, considering there was evidence of mass human rights violations against the Ogiek of Kenya by the Kenyan government. Please move on. So in 2014, the Ogiek community went to Addis Ababa. 26 of us were able to go there. And there was a 2-day hearing on 27 and 28 of 2014 in Addis Ababa. And move on. So you can see one of the Ogiek was giving his whatever. In 2015, the court said, why can't the Ogiek have amicable settlement of the case with the Ogiek community? But the Ogiek community, through the African Commission, where their response gave their condition for the amicable settlement. But the Kenyan government responded with their conditions. And in fact, they were saying every Ogiek must have an ID, must have a birth certificate. Some of the conditions the government were giving could not really support the Ogiek. They really suffered, because you could ask my mother or some of her parents about birth certificate. It is not easy. In fact, some of us got birth certificate because we were traveling outside the country, because we needed a passport. So how can you tell Ogiek everybody must have a birth certificate, which was some of the conditions were not favorable. Please move. So on the 26th May 2017, the African Court, on its 45th session of in Arusha, delivered a judgment ruling in favor of the Ogiek community. The African Court ruled that by evicting the Ogiek from the ancestral land without consulting them or without FPIC, the government had violated the right to land. Another issue is that by file they recognizes Ogiek that as a distinct community. This is the court which declared Ogiek as the indigenous community. I think it is the only community in Kenya which have been declared by the court of law that we are indigenous community in Kenya. Another issue is evicting Ogiek from the forest separated them from their religion, the cultural sites, religious sites,
and the freedom of worship. And also by evicting Ogiek in the same forest, it meant the government violated the right to their free disposal of wealth and natural resources. Move on. So this was we went to court. Over 100 of us went to court in Arusha on the 26th May 2017. So you could see, I think that was the only time the court in Arusha was ever filled to the brim, because when we went in big numbers with our regalia and the rest. Move on. In 2018, the Ogiek celebrated the landmark win even with some of our partners, and you could see them full seated around, and could see myself holding with my regalia and with being congratulated for the big win by the community members. Go ahead. So the court gave 90 days to the Ogiek to make submissions on reparation after they appealing for 60 days. The community complied and acted in accordance with the decision of the court. The first hearing was scheduled to take place in 2019 for the reparation hearing, but it didn't happen. It was then pushed to 2020, but unfortunately the COVID-19 pandemic broke in, and which led to 3 postponement through the year to 2020, all the way to 2021, until recently on the 23rd June 2022, the court decided that they are going to give judgment instead of hearing, because the government kept saying we cannot do it because of COVID-19. While they were doing factual hearing in other cases, they decided they didn't want to listen to the factual hearing in the Ogiek case. So this again also violating the rights of the Ogiek community. But finally, it was delivered in the absence of the government. The side of the government, they never appeared. I think they knew the ruling will favor the Ogiek community. Proceed on. So this is again ourselves. You could see us well dressed in our regalia, just outside the court. And when we were inside the court in Arusha on the 23rd June 2022, 51 community members traveled to Arusha for the same. Proceed on, please. So the judgment was able to bring up that that pay the Ogiek community pecuniary reparations of Kenya shilling 157 million for material prejudice, and 100 million, 57 million being for moral prejudice. Take all necessary measures, legislative, administrative, and otherwise, to identify and delimit and grant collective land title to the Ogiek community, and by law assume them as unhindered use and enjoyment of their land. Take all appropriate measures within 1 year to grant full legal and recognition of the Ogiek community as an indigenous community in an effective manner, including recognition of their language, culture, and religious practices. Continue. So this was a major celebration, which after the win, just continue, please. Yeah, it was still, we were posting a photo with some of our legal team, 2 from UK and 1 from Arusha, and with the community members. Proceed on. So some of the challenges, amidst all these, I think it will be wrong if I finish this without telling you some of us have faced a lot of threats, including people being hired to get rid of us. A major one was done in 2019, and I had to report to the police and the other human rights defenders until senior officers from Nairobi were sent to investigate the issue. And some of the people had collected money to get rid of me. And my colleague also, his house was burned down, and up to now he had to relocate from where he used to stay in his home in the suite. And as we are talking, there are many of our community members who have cases of all sorts, all related to land. And this has led us to spend a lot of money on litigation. And this is one of the challenges which we have. And the challenge we have is about Ogiek and conservation. So the government of Kenya is saying Ogiek, Mau Forest is a protected area. The Ogiek community sees it as their land, their home. they are the right holders of this particular ecosystem. But right now, they feel that there are issues that the court rule, but our worry is whether this government will ever implement the case. But we are optimistic one day it must be realized, because we already have the two will, and they will have to publish it within 1 year. We'll have to go to court to go and give evidence of progress of this particular.
Este progreso de este caso en particular.
To be done, and conservation agencies also they are beginning to understand that the traditional knowledge is key as far as conservation is concerned, and they should not look at the Ogiek as people creating conflict with conservation. Proceed on. So as I said earlier, there's also a lot of lack of political will as one of the greatest hindrances to our case. You could see the police, the forest rangers burning Ogiek houses. That was July 2020, amid this COVID-19. They could still have that courage to do that when people are hidden in their homes because everybody was fearing to move around because of COVID. And I think it was not only in Kenya, it was all over the world. But at that particular time, June, July, the Ogiek, over 500 were evicted in their home, banned, and they say that they had encroached to the forest, despite us having the wind. Move on. So greatest issue is that we have already done conservation. We have proved to the government that we can do conservation using our traditional knowledge. The greatest strength is the use of our community unity has been very great. However, we cannot say it's 100%, but at least a greater percentage of the Ogiek community have been united during the struggle. We have also brought up the youths and the women who have played a big role, especially women. I can say authoritatively, women played a big role. Because in Kenya, I can tell you, it's not easy to bribe women, but very easy to bribe men, unfortunately. I'm a man myself. And this has really made it not very easy for the community sometimes. Move on. So the community unity, speaking in one accord, support from development partners to enable these Ogiek to travel, to speak and to advocate locally, even to the permanent forum, MRIP and the rest, has given us support from the media. We can say, and we really adore the media because they are the one who brought the issues of Ogiek to the limelight. If not for media, nobody will have known our struggle and the challenges we have had. And also we are brought in now youth artists coming on board, which were not there before. Proceed on. Yeah, thank you very much. I know it's very hard to control a presentation. It's easier because some of the issues I could just move forward, but I can say that the policies which we have, especially on land and conservation and environment issues, have been a greatest misgiving or violation of the rights of the Ogiek community. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Daniel. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. Just a reminder to our attendees, if you want to ask any questions, please feel free to put that into the chat. We've got a short but kind of sufficient time to ask questions at the end. I've got some through directly to myself, but if you could also put some in the chat, that would be great. Our third speaker for today is Luciana Keller. Luciana is a PhD candidate in social anthropology at the University of Brasilia and a member researcher at the Observatory for the Human Rights of Isolated and Recent Contact Indigenous Peoples. Since 2017, she's been carrying out research in the Rio Omere indigenous land in southern Rondônia between two newly contacted populations. Before handing over to Luciana, I wanted to touch briefly on the recent killing of Bruno Pereira, a human rights defender working closely with indigenous.
Temos também outras pessoas que trabalham com esse assunto no Brasil e no observatório. Como você já viu, por causa da atenção da mídia, em junho desse ano, com o problema do assassinato do jornalista Don Phillips e do indigenista brasileiro. E foi outro exemplo da violência contra povos indígenas no Vale do Javari, no Brasil.
Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite para todas e todos que estão assistindo a esse webinar ao redor do mundo.
Morning, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here and to participate in this discussion on indigenous rights together with such important speakers. Like I am a PhD in University of Brasilia, and I'm a member of the indigenous rights of the observatory. And my presentation today is a bit about the protection for the indigenous people in Brazil. Brazil is the country with the largest number of indigenous people. In Brazilian Amazon, we have 114 registry of isolated people. According to Brazilian definition, there are people that don't have contact with the majority of the population. In general, they are a population, they are a vulnerable population because they are physically isolated and they are at risk of being contaminated. So if they have contact
de uma população inteira. Existe uma grande diversidade de contextos entre as populações consideradas isoladas, que vão desde pequenos grupos de 2 ou até mesmo um único indivíduo, até populações demograficamente consideráveis. Assim também, a frequência dos contatos voluntários e não voluntários com o seu entorno, ou seja, com outros coletivos indígenas isolados, com populações indígenas contatadas e até com os brancos também variam bastante. A opção pelo isolamento, que muitas vezes não é bem uma opção, mas uma questão de sobrevivência, deve ser respeitada como o direito à autodeterminação, tal qual estabelecido na Convenção 169 da Organização Internacional do Trabalho, a OIT, da qual o Brasil é signatário. O isolamento é, sobretudo, uma decisão política, fundamentada em experiências prévias de contatos traumáticos que vem acontecendo desde o início da colonização. A política de proteção aos povos indígenas isolados e recém-contatados no Brasil é executada pelo governo federal através da FUNAI. É da FUNAI a competência para formular, coordenar, articular e monitorar o cumprimento da política indigenista do Estado brasileiro. Em 1987, após o primeiro encontro de sertanistas, o paradigma da política indigenista para povos isolados sofreu um ponto de inflexão e passou a ser orientado pelo não contato. Dessa forma, o contato passa a acontecer apenas como última opção, caso não haja outra forma de garantir a sobrevivência dessas populações, como foi o caso dos Canoê, do Omerê e dos Acuntiçu em 1995, no estado de Rondônia, populações com as quais eu realizo pesquisa desde 2017. Para desenvolver a política do não contato, foi criada a Coordenação de Índios Isolados, dentro da FUNAI, que a partir de 2009, após a reestruturação do órgão indigenista, passou a se chamar Coordenação Geral de Índios Isolados e de Recente Contato, a CEGIRC. A CEGIRC atua através do Sistema de Proteção aos Índios Isolados e de Recente Contato, que compreende o conjunto das ações organizadas pelas 11 frentes de proteção etnoambiental, unidades de campo que são referência no trabalho de localização, monitoramento, vigilância e proteção dessas populações. Bruno Pereira, indigenista brutalmente assassinado em junho desse ano no Vale do Javari, junto ao jornalista Don Phillips, havia sido coordenador da CEGIRC entre os anos de 2018 e 2019.
Do Javari, he was the coordinator of FUNAI. He was a complete indigenous expert. He knew the area, he dominated the area, he could speak their language. He was respected and loved by all the communities there. And he could understand the state governance, and he had many threats that he could no longer work as he loved to work. During Bolsonaro administration, he was dismissed from his work. And so he was dismissed from FUNAI, and he started to work with Univaja, and he was a member and the founder of OPIP. Bolsonaro administration is a way to erode democratic organizations from the inside. And this is one of the features of this public administration. He was a president.
Bolsonaro, como dice,
Decrees. He signed many decrees. And he has for strategic positions people that are not interested in the main interest in the area. And Marcelo Xavier is one example. And FUNAI is now serving anti-indigenous people's interests, and he represents the interests that are contrary to the indigenous interests. And they have predatory activities in the indigenous areas. This is an announced genocide. And Bruno Pereira was fighting against this. He was fighting for this and complete negligence. And Bruno Pereira was assassinated because of this. And we will go on with his noble fight to monitor and to execute public policies, as well as human rights violation, and propose different strategies and actions to protect these isolated communities, together with the articulation of indigenous people in Brazil. We have this DPS 991, which denounces all the threats as the right to life, identity, integrity, and also the...
Na ADPF, apresentam-se pedidos de cunho estrutural direcionados à União Federal, buscando a implementação de um plano de ação que vise dar efetivo cumprimento das normativas nacionais e internacionais de direitos humanos, viabilizar recursos financeiros e de pessoal para atuação concreta nos territórios, além da possibilidade de monitoramento por parte do Conselho Nacional de Justiça. Essa DPF vem, então, pedir à cúpula do Poder Judiciário que atue, que haja diante do genocídio em curso dos povos indígenas isolados e recém-contatados que habitam o território brasileiro. Para finalizar, termino minha apresentação com o trecho final da carta de despedida do nosso observatório ao querido Bruno, que acho que define muito bem as intenções que colocamos nas nossas lutas e no nosso luto hoje. Adeus para sempre, Bruno. Seguirá havendo cantos nos terreiros, seguirá havendo flechas nos arcos, seguirá havendo espíritos que habitam nas florestas. Os inimigos dos povos do Javarina vão fracassar. Com todos os sonhos indígenas, estás também nos nossos sonhos. Plantado hoje na terra como uma niva...
Planted in our land, we will have your dream that will inspire more lives, more forests, and they will have more land in the Amazon region. Thank you, Bruno, and thank you all.
Thank you, Luciana, for that incredibly powerful presentation. Sorry, bear with me a second. I'm just changing interpretation. There we go. The next speaker that I'm pleased to introduce you to is Laura Rojas. So Laura is part of the criminal litigation team of the Colombian Commission of Jurists. She's a human rights defender, lawyer, and master in criminal law with more than 10 years of experience supporting community victims of the armed conflict in Colombia, with special emphasis on cases of dispossession and confinement of lands. She has taken part in strategic litigation for constitutional change and land restitution in Colombia and before the Inter-American Court. She also has experience in the formalization of rural properties with transboundary indigenous communities. Laura, over to you.
Muchas gracias por la invitación para los colegas.
Thank you very much for the invitation for all of my colleagues and all of our attendees that are joining us worldwide. I would like to extend you a very special greetings. I'm an advocate for the human rights, just as you heard during my very warm introduction. I am part of the Juris Colombian Commission, that is a civil society organization that also has the support of the United Nations, that has been in Colombia ever since 1998, and has been there to work with the litigation and the support to different communities and victims from the internal armed conflict that we have in our country. Today, I'm going to share with you some insights regarding the challenges that we have faced regarding the restitution of lands, specifically on everything that has to do with indigenous rights. This is a reparation measure within the framework of the law for victims, for the reparation of victims, that within the framework of the war has lost the right
de los territorios, sino también el despojo de sus recursos naturales, también el confinamiento, el abandono de los territorios en el marco de la guerra. Eso se reconoció después de que la Corte Constitucional de Colombia en el año 2004 promulga un auto donde decreta el grave riesgo de exterminio físico y cultural en el que se encuentran más de 32 pueblos indígenas. En Colombia hay más de 104 pueblos originarios. Y este auto es muy importante porque efectivamente recoge una situación alarmante de falta de articulación del Estado en la atención tanto al desplazamiento forzado como a los impactos diferenciados que la guerra tiene sobre los pueblos indígenas. Posteriormente, en el año 2011, se promulga la Ley de Víctimas y de Restitución de Tierras, y para pueblos indígenas se expide el Decreto Ley 4633 del 2011. Yo voy a compartir con ustedes un estudio de caso de un resguardo indígena
sobre
en toda la frontera de Colombia con el Ecuador.
Indígena que aconteceu na fronteira da Colômbia com o Equador.
Es un territorio
Ecuador. This is a transborder territory.
E com certeza esse território é um território transnacional, ou seja, transfronteiriço. E é um território que já tem essa luta há bastante anos. Eles estão tendo dificuldade na defesa desse território, e nós estamos lá como nós da Comissão Colombiana de Justiça estamos lá para analisar como os senhores podem ver, esses territórios tem suas próprias dificuldades, e o fato é que nós temos diferentes organizações que estão apoiando essa luta. Eles também são bastante ativos na posição política, e nós também entramos com processos cautelares.
No ha sido posible lograr ni la garantía de los derechos al territorio, ni el cumplimiento ni de las recomendaciones de la CIDH, ni de las medidas cautelares, ni de la lucha por la pervivencia que tiene el pueblo Luciana. Ustedes pueden ver.
Então, como podem ver,
let's go to the previous slide. I'm sorry.
Não, voltem ao slide anterior, por
Let's
favor.
stay there for a while. Thank you.
Vamos ficar nesse slide ainda um pouquinho mais.
And here you can see that this is a border territory, and here we have the Putumayo River, and this region is characterized because we have a lot of oil activity. So here we have three blocks: the Platanillo, the block Put 12 and Put 9, So you can see that it is on the western part of it, and it has some specific exploitation points. Besides, we have a pipeline that goes under the Putumayo River, and it is affecting the natural resources. And of course, this is also impacting the way in which the military forces are being deployed there. And here we can see how they're working this together with the private sector. And of course, this is causing many different impacts over this territory. Now, having in mind the persistence of the different risks that we may have in this region, and also the presence of different armed groups in this territory, and how they may struggle to have a greater presence in this territory, we can see that there are higher risks of recruiting or forced recruitment to armed forces. And we have seen some combats, we have seen some eradication combats, and we have seen many different struggles. And all of this has to do with the lack of compliance with the peace accords that were signed back in 2016. And of course, for this territory, it is causing a lot of pressure in territorial terms, given the different interests that there might be over this territory, and given the different armed forces that are being deployed in this part, in this territory, besides the stigmatization that this territory is being subject to, given
Es clave entender que el proceso de restitución es un proceso judicial, efectivamente, donde las empresas petroleras también han llegado a oponerse a las garantías de los derechos. Esta demanda que nosotros acompañamos tiene en este momento bloqueado, si nos podemos devolver por favor a la imagen anterior, toda la zona de lo que ustedes ven ahí en pantalla como bloque PUT 12, Putumayo 12 y bloque PUT 9 en un área de territorio que todavía no está formalizado, que es territorio ancestral y que tiene múltiples líneas de sísmica para la exploración petrolera. Esto, digamos, tiene unos efectos bastante importantes porque hay una especulación a nivel internacional, incluso pues con las reservas de crudo, particularmente en este momento. Es muy importante tener en consideración, digamos, que la comunidad ha venido, digamos, estableciendo distintas estrategias, entre ellas la conformación de la Guardia Indígena. La Guardia Indígena es un cuerpo vivo de carácter humanitario, civil, que tiene un arraigo muy fuerte en la espiritualidad de este pueblo indígena. Ellos son una comunidad que tienen en el centro de su cultura el yagé, la ayahuasca, las ceremonias espirituales, y a partir de ahí se direcciona la necesidad de visibilizarse en el territorio. Infortunadamente, aunque la Constitución de Colombia de 1991 reconoce la diversidad étnica y cultural, aunque Colombia ha ratificado el convenio 169 de la OIT, aunque hay, digamos, múltiples tratados e instrumentos internacionales de protección y de garantía a los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, sigue habiendo en la práctica muchísima estigmatización, persecución, señalamientos contra la Guardia Indígena, lo cual ocurre en Colombia, digamos, en un contexto de violencia sociopolítica, pero también ocurre en el Ecuador, que es justo, digamos, el territorio que para ellos no hay una frontera real administrativa de los estados, sino un uso constante de toda una zona con carácter transfronterizo. Y podemos irnos a la última imagen, por favor. Ustedes pueden ver ahí una presentación que hizo una de las asambleístas del Ecuador en el año 2021, donde estaban señalando como parte de actores armados irregulares, comandos de frontera, particularmente y grupos de las disidencias de las FARC, a la Guardia Indígena. Y se les señalaba como parte de los actores armados irregulares e ilegales que están en Colombia, y se estigmatizaba fuertemente por parte del el exministro de Defensa del Ecuador a la Guardia. Esto es supremamente importante porque además tengamos en consideración que tanto en Colombia como en Ecuador en los últimos 3 años han habido múltiples movilizaciones y protestas sociales. Ya podemos, digamos, quitar las imágenes, por favor. Gracias. Han habido múltiples movilizaciones que han tenido un componente muy fuerte de los reclamos de los pueblos indígenas y de participación de las organizaciones indígenas y de las comunidades, particularmente de estas transfronterizas. Y hay un tema que no es menor, y es el señalamiento y la estigmatización por parte del gobierno ecuatoriano y la connivencia del gobierno colombiano. Y esto viene sucediendo desde varios años, digamos. Han habido erradicación con glifosato, fumigaciones de cultivos de uso ilícito en toda la zona de la frontera, que ha generado contaminación, que ha generado daños, que ha generado incluso responsabilidad internacional, porque, digamos, ocurre sobre también territorio ecuatoriano en esta zona, que no se ha garantizado los derechos a la consulta previa del consentimiento libre e informado de las comunidades afectadas, pero que además se hace con un fuerte componente militar y no civil, tanto para la atención de la problemática de los cultivos como para el tema de las minas antipersonales. Y esto es un asunto que pone en muchísimo riesgo a las comunidades y que ha sido visibilizado por la Comisión Colombiana de Juristas y por otras organizaciones que acompañamos el caso de manera estratégica y que está en las redes, digamos, también de el resguardo y de las otras organizaciones, como les mencionaba, pero que sigue siendo una persistencia, los incumplimientos y la falta de garantías que tienen las comunidades en los escenarios pues judiciales, pero también la lucha que ellos han mantenido por persistir en el territorio. Esta construcción del enemigo interno binacional es supremamente nocivo y ha generado unas narrativas que son bastante complejas, porque además está acompañado de judicializaciones, está acompañado, digamos, también de la legitimidad de la intervención militar que facilita la actividad extractiva, es decir, no puede tenerse como un hecho aislado la presencia petrolera, y por eso empezábamos en ese momento con la primera de las imágenes donde ustedes podían ver cómo era la actividad. En la época del COVID, de la pandemia, los gobiernos no atendieron de manera idónea a las comunidades de frontera, y por el contrario, la decisión del cierre tuvo muchísimos impactos en la economía local. Sin embargo, nunca se paró la actividad petrolera, nunca se paró el bombeo binacional de crudo. Los focos de contagio inicial se dieron por trabajadores de la petrolera, y esto ha sido, digamos, denunciado, y ustedes pueden encontrar en la página, como les mencionaba, tanto de las organizaciones como del propio resguardo, esta situación. Y es, digamos, bastante nocivo para el derecho a la autodeterminación y el derecho al gobierno propio y a las estrategias de seguridad colectiva que desde los territorios se fortalecen, como son las guardias indígenas. Esto ha sido también bastante complejo porque en las recientes movilizaciones en el Ecuador han habido señalamientos a los encuentros autónomos que se han dado particularmente en la zona del Putumayo, en esta zona de la frontera norte, donde se hacen intercambios legítimos entre pueblos hermanos. Y esto ha sido señalado como una suerte de entrenamiento militar a indígenas ecuatorianos por parte de sus pares en la frontera colombiana. Y esto sabemos que incrementa los riesgos, pero que además pone en muchísimo peligro a los dirigentes cuyas fotografías han sido expuestas en espacios parlamentarios, como fue el caso que les mostré. Esta situación...
Laura, disculpa, si puedes por favor ir cerrando, que te queda un minuto.
Sí, ya iba cerrando, Simón, muchísimas gracias. Como les mencionaba, esta es una situación bastante compleja a nivel de las estrategias legales que utilizamos las organizaciones. Es, digamos, participar en todos los escenarios legislativos e incluso judiciales, como el proceso de restitución de derechos territoriales, las medidas cautelares y recientemente la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you, Laura. That was an incredibly interesting presentation. So thanks for your insights. Before we introduce our last speaker, just a final reminder to put any questions that you may have in the chat. We have a little bit less time than expected for the Q&A, but we still have time to go through a few questions. Finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Sandra Paula Naranjo Arizabal. Sandra is a lawyer and advisor to the National Commission of Indigenous Territories. She has worked in research in the defense of rights of rural populations in Colombia. Thanks, Sandra. She's a late replacement for Ricardo Camillo Niño's Piero, had a last-minute commitment, so thanks for coming in at such short notice. The floor is yours, Sandra.
Jacob, buenos días y buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por permitirnos este espacio para compartir un poco el trabajo que ha venido desarrollando la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas. No sé si puedo compartir la presentación. Vale. Bueno, la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas es el espacio nacional de diálogo de los pueblos indígenas con el gobierno nacional. Aquí se discuten como todos los temas que tienen que ver con el reconocimiento de los derechos territoriales de los pueblos indígenas. La siguiente, por favor. Entonces es un espacio que está conformado por delegaciones del gobierno nacional y de las 5 organizaciones nacionales, 5 organizaciones reconocidas a nivel nacional de los pueblos indígenas. Siguiente, por favor. Bueno, digamos que yo en general voy a complementar lo que acaba de mencionar Laura. En Colombia hay 115 pueblos indígenas, esto representa el 4.5% de la población. El último censo identificó que se trata de una población que está creciendo. Esta población habita alrededor de 720 resguardos indígenas, lo que corresponde a un 28,9 millones de hectáreas, lo que a su vez corresponde al 25% del territorio nacional. Por esta razón, los pueblos indígenas han sido estigmatizados por parte de la ultraderecha al señalar que se trata de población terrateniente, lo que no es tan real, no es tan ajustado a la realidad en la medida en que la mayoría del territorio que estos poseen o que es de su propiedad se trata de tierra infértil o está ocupado por bosques, por lo cual, digamos, no tendrían una vocación agrícola o de productividad como se les indica. Como ya lo mencionó Laura, hay importantes pronunciamientos de la Corte Constitucional, entre otros, en donde se reconoce la desproporcionada afectación que ha tenido el conflicto armado frente a los pueblos indígenas, al punto que alrededor del 15% de su población ha sido víctima de algún hecho, digamos, en el contexto del conflicto, pero más allá de esta afectación individual, uno podría decir que casi todos los pueblos indígenas del país, estos 115 pueblos, han sido afectados por la guerra en Colombia. La siguiente, por favor. Bueno, esto es solo para mostrarles cómo la parte amarilla son los resguardos, los territorios que son de propiedad de los pueblos indígenas, que son inembargables, imprescriptibles, inalienables, es decir, solo pueden ser para ellos y no pueden ser vendidos ni entregados a ninguna otra persona o tercero. Y los que están más oscuros muestran todas las solicitudes de reconocimiento que han hecho los pueblos indígenas y que aún no están siendo formalizados por el Estado colombiano. Ahí deriva una gran conflictividad que pasaremos a exponer. La siguiente, por favor. Bueno, un panorama general del estado actual de las garantías de los derechos territoriales de los pueblos indígenas nos indica lo siguiente. La Constitución Política del 91 hizo un importante reconocimiento tanto a la diversidad étnica y cultural como a los derechos territoriales de los pueblos indígenas. Sin embargo, ha habido desde ese momento una ausencia absoluta de voluntad política para la garantía de estos derechos, al punto que actualmente hay 1.034 solicitudes de constitución de estos resguardos, 181 solicitudes para la protección de los territorios ancestrales, 90, bueno, etcétera. Digamos que en general hay 1.450 casos en curso, frente a los cuales hay muy pocos expedientes abiertos, muchos de ellos con un retraso de al menos 40 años, lo que lleva a que, digamos, ese reconocimiento que se hizo constitucionalmente haya sido, digamos, muy de forma más que de fondo, todo esto en un escenario de conflictividad territorial que se presenta en Colombia alrededor de los múltiples intereses que hay sobre el territorio, como ya lo exponía Laura, en materia de explotación y extracción de recursos naturales, y que se surte entre comunidades rurales, pero también con multinacionales, con empresas, etcétera, y que, digamos, dan cuenta de toda esa conflictividad territorial en la que están inmersos los pueblos indígenas. La siguiente, por favor. Ahora, con este gran panorama lo que quisiéramos presentar es una idea general en relación con las políticas de seguridad nacional, que para nosotros tienen que ver sobre todo con la seguridad interna, dada la complejidad que esto ha tenido en un país, digamos, inmerso en un conflicto como el nuestro. Entonces, para destacar estas políticas, una primera, y es la siguiente, ha sido una simulación y tergiversación de la implementación del Acuerdo Final de Paz, un acuerdo que propuso una nueva estrategia de seguridad interna, dado que frente a un escenario complejo de militarización de la vida civil, lo que propuso el Acuerdo Final de Paz celebrado entre las FARC, de las Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia y el Gobierno Nacional, pretendían que la seguridad fuera comprendida como una llegada estatal al territorio, pero una llegada con política social al territorio, por encima que una estrategia de llegada del Estado por medio de las armas. Y digamos que esto hace un vuelco definitivo de la, digamos, de la política de seguridad interna en Colombia. Desafortunadamente, la implementación de este acuerdo en este último gobierno, que afortunadamente está por terminar, llevó a una tergiversación de su contenido y no logró la implementación que se esperaba. Para destacar de este acuerdo, digamos, 3 puntos importantes. Un primer elemento que contenía este acuerdo o que contiene este acuerdo son los derechos y garantías plenas para el ejercicio de la oposición política. En Colombia, la oposición política ha sido históricamente estigmatizada y exterminada. Tenemos a cuestas un genocidio y están en esclarecerse otros más. Esto implicaba en el acuerdo el establecimiento de un sistema integral de seguridad para el ejercicio de la política. Puede sonar un poco alarmante en otros países, pero para nosotros era necesario que se constituyera una política de seguridad para que quienes ejercen la oposición lo puedan ejercer sin que les cueste la vida. Y en el marco de este sistema se crean unas garantías de seguridad para los líderes y lideresas de organizaciones y movimientos sociales y defensoras de derechos humanos. Estos sistemas no fueron creados, han sido tergiversados, se les han montado unos escenarios, digamos, paralelos que no lograron suplir lo que pretendía el acuerdo final. Lo mismo ocurre con un segundo componente a destacar del acuerdo, que son las garantías de participación de organizaciones y movimientos sociales, en especial las garantías de movilización y la protesta pacífica. Digamos que aquí se pretendía la configuración de una comisión de diálogo que planteara unos elementos al gobierno nacional para crear unas modificaciones a las leyes sobre la protesta pacífica. Esto no tuvo lugar y, al contrario, lo que ha venido ocurriendo es que se han recrudecido, digamos, la respuesta estatal a los escenarios de movilización social, tanto así que en un paro nacional que ha tenido importante trascendencia en el año anterior y que da cuenta de cómo el acuerdo de paz en todo caso genera una movilización en términos a los discursos y a la posibilidad de la paz en Colombia, llevó a una fuerte confrontación de la que fueron especialmente víctimas los pueblos indígenas, quienes viendo la confrontación en los escenarios, digamos, urbanos, se acercaron al escenario urbano, salieron de su territorio con la Guardia Indígena como forma de hacer presencia, de proteger a la población, de también reivindicar sus derechos, y fueron terriblemente estigmatizados. Hubo homicidios, hubo balaceras, etcétera, todas ellas promovidas por discursos de la ultraderecha en contra de la población indígena.
The ultra-right against the indigenous populations. Another very important point with the agreement has to do with the fight against criminal.
En especial las organizaciones derivadas del paramilitarismo, figura que tampoco ha sido desarrollada. Y finalmente, 2 puntos muy importantes que, al lado de estas propuestas de seguridad con una versión diferente, una versión un poco más humana de la seguridad, las acompañaban, y es la reforma rural integral y la solución al problema de las drogas ilícitas, que en general implicaban un conjunto de políticas sociales, de educación, salud, comercialización, vivienda, etcétera, llegada al territorio y atención a la población que se ha visto obligada a la siembra de cultivos de uso ilícito como opción más racional y más exitosa y digamos, posible. La idea es que en conjunto con estas políticas de seguridad hubiera, digamos, unas medidas de desarrollo que pudieran impulsar la seguridad en estricto sentido en los territorios. Esto no ha sido así. Como les decía, estas figuras han sido tergiversadas y, digamos, no han sido cumplidas, lo que lleva a que, desafortunadamente, a un repertorio de disminución de la estigmatización y del exterminio de los líderes defensores de derechos humanos y en los territorios durante la conversación del acuerdo de paz, y a su firma, empezó a haber desafortunadamente un nuevo incremento sistemático, esta vez ya no con hechos masivos como desplazamientos y masacres, como ha sido desafortunadamente el repertorio de la guerra en Colombia, sino a partir de un exterminio más uno a uno de los líderes sociales, lo que no quiere decir que ya no hayan desplazamientos y masacres, pero aquí se destaca sobre todo un exterminio selectivo de los líderes sociales, donde los pueblos indígenas vienen siendo el grupo poblacional más afectado, pues le sigue la población campesina, digamos, es la población rural la más afectada por este exterminio selectivo. Y como se puede ver a lo largo de los años, pues esto ha venido aumentando. La siguiente, por favor. Desafortunadamente, el acuerdo final de paz planteó unos énfasis en unos territorios que se ven pues, con unos colores en el fondo del mapa. Estos territorios se supone que era donde iba a llegar el desarrollo y las políticas de intervención social del Estado, y como ustedes pueden ver, los puntos rojos son donde se concentra este exterminio selectivo a los líderes indígenas. Digamos que se superponen, hay una contradicción entre esas zonas en donde el Estado iba a llegar a proteger de una manera diferente a como se supone lo venía haciendo, y digamos, donde se ha incrementado este exterminio a la población indígena, que casualmente coincide con donde hay una concentración de los escenarios de movilización social más importantes de la población indígena en Colombia, que es en el suroccidente colombiano. La siguiente, por favor. Ahora bien, una de las cosas que digamos, las políticas que han incidido son ese acuerdo de paz incumplido, pero paralelamente también se han desarrollado políticas que le son contrarias al acuerdo final de paz y que recrudecen, reafirman, profundizan la implementación de políticas de seguridad que son altamente estigmatizantes y militaristas en Colombia. Un ejemplo de ello, por ejemplo, es el desconocimiento de un enfoque territorial del acuerdo final. Como ustedes les mostraba ahorita, estas zonas de color en donde el acuerdo pretendía ser el lugar de énfasis para que el Estado llegara con sus políticas sociales, y lo que está, digamos, tachado es es la política del actual gobierno que está por terminar, que se superpone a esa política del acuerdo que se llamó la estrategia de zonas estratégicas de intervención integral, o denominadas zonas futuro, que por el contrario lo que buscaban era una absoluta militarización del territorio. ¿Sí? Entonces entran en choque un planteamiento de paz con una recuperación de esas políticas militaristas que desafortunadamente se ponen en tensión y hacen inviable, digamos, esas bases para la construcción de la paz en Colombia. La siguiente, por favor. Por el otro lado, también el acuerdo final de paz plantea varias figuras que planteen un cierre a la frontera agrícola, dado que, digamos, todos nuestros recursos naturales, bosques y sistemas de conservación están siendo puestos en riesgo, y pues la historia de ocupación del territorio en Colombia ha sido la expansión ya de esas zonas de conservación que se han ido deteriorando. Entonces el acuerdo final proponía unas figuras justamente para suspender eso, figuras que se concentraban principalmente en la garantía y el reconocimiento de los derechos territoriales a pueblos indígenas y campesinos. Sin embargo, lo que ha propuesto el gobierno que está por terminar es una campaña denominada Artemisa, que implicaba llegar a estas zonas donde se ve el rojo, que es toda esta zona donde se está concentrando la deforestación en Colombia. Se pretendía llegar, digamos, es una política de control a la deforestación que no es, digamos, en manos de la autoridad ambiental, sino que se la delegó a las fuerzas militares para llegar a los territorios, y lo que generó fue un escenario de estigmatización a los pueblos indígenas y campesinos, y no a los grandes intereses que hay allí detrás, que tienen que ver con ganadería, cultivos extensivos, minería y etcétera. Entonces, este es digamos, una nueva política que, en contravía del acuerdo final de paz, reafirma esa política de securitización y militarización del territorio. La siguiente, por favor.
Sandra, te quedan 2 minutos, por favor.
Listo. Esta entonces eran las ideas generales finales, y es plantear lo siguiente: el acuerdo final de paz en Colombia significó una transformación de la comprensión del tema de seguridad en Colombia. Sin embargo, el actual gobierno, que fue opositor a la adopción de este acuerdo, lo que planteó fue, digamos, ignoró el acuerdo y planteó políticas que le son contradictorias, reafirmó, digamos, una estrategia de seguridad y de militarización de los territorios que ha sido, digamos, gran causante, gran nudo de la guerra en Colombia. Sin embargo, ante la elección de un nuevo gobierno al mando de Gustavo Petro y la vicepresidenta Francia Márquez, en donde se espera, digamos, es el primer gobierno de una tendencia progresista en Colombia, digamos que se abre un escenario nunca antes visto en el país, en donde, digamos, se espera poder implementar ahora sí un acuerdo de paz que ha sido postergado, que ha sido diluido y tergiversado, y en donde se espera pues que se den otro escenario de comprensión de la seguridad nacional, en donde para la Comisión Nacional de Territorios Indígenas al menos se deberían considerar tres elementos importantes. Uno es la presencia estatal en materia de garantía de derechos por encima de la militar. Uno segundo, que es la reforma a los cuerpos policiales de represión de la protesta social, y lo que se espera es que se eliminen estos cuerpos policiales. Y una tercera, que haya una participación social amplia de las organizaciones sociales y de las comunidades en los diseños de la política pública de seguridad en Colombia. Sería eso para compartir. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, and thanks to Sandra and all our speakers for their presentations today. I hope, like you've all managed to learn a lot about each of their work. Before heading into the Q&A, I wish to just provide a few concluding remarks. So, as I mentioned at the outset, while the experiences of each of our speakers vary, and they also span different continents, there are similarities between their experiences. A couple I've noted are kind of corporate, private sector involvement, both formal and informal in rights violations, partly acting with impunity. Secondly, I've got noted a lack of involvement of Indigenous groups in decision-making and policy-making processes, causing kind of further human rights concerns. Some of our speakers spoke about kind of false labeling of Indigenous groups as terrorist or maybe even extremist organizations. And the final kind of general point I wanted to note was kind of the use of the law as a weapon by some political actors. Despite this, we've heard that there's opportunities for wins and opportunities for incorporating human rights into decision-making processes, and I think that's a heartening lesson to take away from today. As I mentioned at the outset, these common themes I think demonstrate the potential for broader collaborative advocacy on issues relating to Indigenous rights, particularly how these movements are treated in a securitized way by authorities that can take an effect on a global scale. Alongside this, there's the potential to learn from some of the impactful and often creative strategies that some of our speakers mentioned today, used by them and other partners across the globe. It's on that note that I want to go very briefly to the Q&A function. I think we'll only have time for a couple of questions, which I've selected already. So I'm going to group a couple of questions together here for some quick responses. So I have two questions here that are linked. So firstly, I've had someone ask, how can organizations and activists from other countries, for instance, those based in the UK, become engaged with supporting Indigenous rights? And secondly, how do you advocate against private sector involvement in rights violations? And does that add an extra layer of difficulty to your work? So two kind of semi-linked questions there. Does anyone want to jump in on that? Anybody?
So,
yeah, Daniel, go.
Yeah, thank you very much. Those are very, very heavy questions, because being engaged on Indigenous people's movement, I always tell people it's personal. Personal because if you want to engage yourself in movements, first you must be ready to be part of the movement. Because issues of Indigenous people is self-identification, and also whether your community are considered in your country to be Indigenous or you consider yourself Indigenous.
And in this case, you should join already existing movements. Like now we have forums, like Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. We have MRIP, that's another mechanism. We have also in other countries, they have, like in Asia, they have an indigenous people called AIPP, which is basically bringing all the indigenous people in Asia. In Africa, we have one called IPAC, which is also bringing indigenous peoples. And there are also national organizations who are fighting for the rights of indigenous peoples. But one of the greatest challenge is that it is not easy walk in the park when you are dealing with indigenous peoples, because as we discussed, there are always threats, violations of their rights, and even non-compliant on issues of FPIC, where they are not consulted, even including the private sector. The private sector, they don't want to deal with indigenous peoples mostly. They want to deal with the government so that they come and invest or do extractive industries in indigenous peoples' lands and territories using the power of the government, because they don't want to compensate, or rather to console or talk with indigenous peoples, even have benefit sharing mechanism with indigenous people, but instead they will prefer to work direct with the government, because they will come with licenses from the government telling you, we have been given power to construct a dam here, to drill, or to get diamond in many other countries and such like, or to harvest, to do logging in our forests, and do that using the government permission. So basically, that's much I can say. Maybe my other colleagues can add to that. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. So just a reminder, because I think it didn't get through the translation. So the questions were about how can activists from other countries, for instance, in the UK, engage with Indigenous rights and become more involved with them. And then secondly, given that a lot of the issues here stem from corporate private sector involvement in human rights violations, how do you kind of push back against that, and does it add an extra degree of complexity to your work? We have I think an extra 5-10 minutes if people are able to stay on the line then, but yeah, for anyone else who wants to answer those.
Yes, hello, Jacob. Thank you very much for those very interesting questions. Just to add to what Daniel has already said, we have an experience where a UK-based mining company was trying to enter our lands. It's called the Anglo-American. It's among the top gold mining companies, and its headquarters is based in the UK. So through various individuals and organizations, we were able to bring community leaders from the ground to attend the annual general meeting of Anglo-American. And it was only that that time that Anglo-American was able to listen to the community's opposition against the mining project. So we had a gain from that. The Anglo-American has eventually backed out. It withdrew its project from the Cordillera. So those are among the concrete examples of how individuals or organizations may support, whether they are in the UK or elsewhere in the world. So because we are trying to follow this, because many of the companies that are trying to invest in our lands are actually transnational or foreign companies for mining, for energy, or other forms of destructive projects. So it would be good to join us in these campaigns to be able to follow our campaigns. There are specific campaigns that we hold, for instance, against companies involved in extractive industries. We also have specific campaigns in relation to human rights, national security policies, and peace in the countries. So aside from supporting our participation, or you yourselves participating in the lobby in United Nations processes, you definitely could contribute in, for instance, raising awareness, because when the world knows what is actually happening here, there's just so many specific ways of extending support. You may also organize your own awareness and education activities, and the indigenous peoples can be resource persons of such activities. Now, on the private sector involvement, that's true. We deal a lot with private companies, most especially. We dialogue whenever possible. It's not easy. It's never easy. The struggle for land for us indigenous peoples it goes a long way, and it continues to be difficult, but we continue to fight. So we try to explore all avenues possible where we are able to engage the private sector. Various forms of protest, dialogue, and dissent, and name it, we try to do it. So I think the more important point here is that we alone as indigenous peoples cannot win our battles. So it's really important to have these collaborations with various groups and individuals, and solidarity relations, so that we are able to extend support, mutual support and cooperation in any way that we can, so that we are able to stand with each other as we continue supporting the fight of indigenous peoples to our right to self-determination, because ultimately our struggles are not for ourselves. It's not for indigenous peoples alone, but in fact, these struggles benefit the whole of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, and I think that's a great point to conclude on. Bestain, that's very insightful. Thank you. You may have seen, to our attendees, Simon's placed in the chat a survey. We'd be grateful if you could fill that out for us. It's just a short survey with a few questions. We hold quite a lot of webinars, or the Rise Coalition holds a lot of webinars, and so it would really help us as we're developing these further. Simon, was there anything you wanted to add or just mention to the participants?
No, the survey will just take you a couple of minutes. I'll just have to highlight what you said, Jacob. I'm really pleased and glad for your contributions today. Thank you so much for all the panelists, to the audience that's been with us until now. I know we deal with various time difference, so it's quite late in the Philippines. It's quite early in Colombia. So thank you so much that you made an effort to be here. And just check our work on our website, and Rights and Security International, and also in our section, the Rights Coalition. You're more than welcome to for your organization and your application to join the Rights Coalition. We are throughout the Global South, and we're working with various topics around national security and human rights. So thank you so much for joining today this webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists.
Thanks, everyone, and look forward to speaking and working with you all soon.
Okay. Have a great day. Have a great evening, and thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Hasta luego.
Muito obrigada. Tchau, tchau, gente.